Hello and welcome to this video on Grid. Grid is one of those essential critical parts to style that once you really fully understand it, you can build anything. And it's a real milestone in your coding career. And it absolutely takes practice. So practice makes progress. And so that's what we're going to do today. I'm starting here. I've got an HTML file. I've got a CSS file. I've got my doc type already in there, and I'm going to go ahead and go right in between the body tags. That's where all the content goes that's on the screen. Now, Grid is all about the parent and child relationship, right? If body is the parent of all of the main containers that we have in a website, then those containers are almost always the same, right? HTML is a story. We're telling a story. It's a narrative from top to bottom. So it always has a beginning and a middle and an end. And by default, by definition, header is the container we use as our introduction. Then we have main. That's our main story, right? And then the end is footer. That's our conclusion. All right, so almost every web page is going to have at least these three: header, main, and footer. The beginning of the story, the end of the story, right? Beginning, middle, and end. Now, some stories are more complicated and they have, say, a nav. Nav is optional. Nav can hang out on its own, which is what we're going to do here. It can be its own container, and nav can actually be inside of header. It just depends on what you're working on. There's a flexibility there, but nav can be inside header. But here we're going to let it be on its own. And then additionally, we can also have a story with asides, tangents, things that if you like the main story, you might also like this. And if we have an aside, it's going to be after main. Because if we're reading this content as a narrative from A to B, but top to bottom, we're reading the intro, the table of contents, the main story, other things you might like because you like that main story, and then the conclusion. Right? So it's very much so telling a story from top to bottom. This is how it has to be, typically, to make sense to a screen reader that's going to read it out loud from the top to the bottom. Visually, we can make this do whatever we want to, and that's what we're going to do in the style. But what we've set up here is that parent to child relationship, and you can see body is the parent of our 5 containers: header, nav, main, aside, and footer. Now then, that's all I'm going to do with that. What I want to do is just add in some words so we know visually on the page where it's going to be. All right, so very not semantic. There's no tags around these. I'm just writing words in these containers so that we can see what they are when we render this page. All right. The point here is about the styling. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and I'll show you what that looks like so we can set up that expectation. Here it is in the default browser, and I'm just going to zoom in a whole bunch. So I'm at 400%, so as we move forward, keep that in mind. All right, header, nav, main, aside, and footer. Now you might be asking yourself, hey, you put code in, you put content, but there's like no tag. Yeah, that's terrible. You would not do that. But why did it render? It's wrong. Well, that's because a browser wants to deliver the content, and it is. So again, we're going to get past that because we are looking more about where we're going to style these containers, and we're just putting some content in so we can see where they are. Now I'm going to flip over to the style, and I'm going to declare who the grid is, right? Who's the parent? And we're going to say body. Body is the parent. So display grid. And we'll go ahead and hit save and refresh in the browser. And I'll show you that that's the normal document flow. Grid on its own, displaying grid, doesn't do anything. It has to have more information. It wants to know what kind of grid you want, how many columns, more details. However, flex only works one direction. It only defaults to vertical, but it can't do vertical and horizontal at the same time the way grid is. So if we have flex and we save and we refresh in our browser, you can see that it now goes vertical, right? Or horizontal, pardon. So they line up across the top. And so that's the difference between flex and grid, is that flex can only deal with one direction at a time. So if you want like the least code possible and you wanted them to be horizontal, which a lot of times with navigation I do, flex is it, right? One thing and done. Now, we don't want that. So we're going to take flex out. And we're going to go back to grid and save, and I'm going to refresh to show you it goes back to normal. All right. Do I refresh after every piece of code that I write in CSS? I absolutely do, because then I know where my mistake is. So I talk through it as I'm writing, and I say I'm going to make the body display grid, and I'm going to do that because I want to style it later, and I shouldn't have any change on my page. Save, refresh in the browser, and I can see it didn't. So I'm just kind of confirming that I did what I wanted to do and that there hasn't caused a conflict. All right, anyhow. This is what it is by default. I don't really have to say display grid in order to get the mobile first style, because mobile first is always going to be typically going to be in this order, single column stacked on top. So I don't really have to put anything in here, but just to show you what's happening as a default is that display grid is doing a grid template columns of 1 FR, which is 1 fraction. Every container, every child is getting 1 fraction of the page. So I'll save and refresh in browser, and you can see that's what was already happening, meaning it's a single column of content. Flip back over just so that we can see it a little bit better in my global style, meaning I want it to account for all of the media queries that I eventually write. I want all of my containers, so header, nav, main, aside, and footer, to also just have some background color. So I'm going to give them background color, and I'll do RGB and just come up with a color. So 255, 200, 100. You can see there it's going to be that kind of butter yellow. And I'll save and I'll refresh, and it should have the effect of putting all of my containers with a background color. It does. Fantastic. And then I'm going to also add just a little margin so we can see the separation of those just as we're coding here. So I'll give it a margin of just like 5 pixels. Hit save, refresh in my browser, and now you can see where those containers are. Because it's in grid, now they're going, because it's the normal document flow, because it's in global style, mobile first with 1 column, we see it just stretches out. Those are the only rules we have. So it's just going to go along with whatever our browser size is. So whether it's a small mobile size or more like a tablet or larger screen, it's going to do that. Awesome. This is what it's doing by default. This is the global style. So changing that style with grid is as easy as overwriting the specifications that we have for grid. So we're going to go ahead and add a media query that is only going to happen during screen and a minimum width of, let's say, 200 pixels. And then we'll put curly braces, and that's our media query. So whatever styles are going to be added here inside this media query are only going to happen when it's being viewed on a screen device that's got a minimum width of 200. And you know what? I'm going to make that bigger because I know my screen doesn't go down that low. I'll make it 500. All right, so I'm going to hit save, and now I'm going to make sure that it didn't mess anything up. Good. And I'm going to then overwrite this, right? I want there to be 2 columns now, because if I have a little bit more space, then I want there to be 2 columns. I only have to overwrite this one rule right here. I don't need to write display grid again because it's still going to do that. I'm not going to overwrite that. I just want to overwrite the grid template column. I like to copy that rule, paste it into my media query, and then say, I don't go through each one and say, okay, I don't want to change that. I still want it to be display grid. So I'm just going to delete it. And then, yes, I do want to change grid template columns. I want to say 1FR, 1FR. And then I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to say, when I go back to my browser, I should see 2 columns when I hit 500 pixels. So I'm going to go back to my browser and I'm going to hit refresh. And remember, I zoomed way in, so now I'm going to zoom out so we can see what's happening there. I'm still at 200%, so keep that in mind. But here I have 2 columns because my screen is bigger than 500 pixels. And when I go down to lower than 500 pixels, it goes to the global style, which is 1 column. All right, so my global style is 1 column. At 500 pixels, it changes to 2 columns. And it'll stay there because we don't have any other rules. So it'll continue to be true until we overwrite that with some other media query. Now then, note they're still in the same order: header, nav, main, aside, footer. But we've implicitly told the browser that there's 2 columns now. So just take the content in its order and shuffle that into 2. But we can get more explicit, and we will in a little. Let's go back to our media screen, and let's make another media query. So I'm just going to copy this one and paste it in. And now I'm going to say min width of 600 pixels. And at that change, I want there to be 3 columns. So I'm going to add another FR. And I'm going to hit save, and then I'm going to flip back to my browser, hit refresh, and because I'm over 600, it is showing me 3 columns, still in document order. So global style, 1 column, 1FR. At 500 pixels, switching to 2 columns, right? 1FR, 1FR. And then at 600, it's switching to 3. 1FR, 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 and it's still in order: header, nav, main, aside, and footer. Very satisfying to squish the page up and down. Now, we've just overwritten one rule, right, in each of these things. We have not changed very much, so you can see where with grid, the overall style of the page, the placement of items is super easy to change. Now, what if we don't want it to look like this? What if we don't want header to share a line with anything else? So now we're getting more explicit. So generally speaking, we want it in 3 or 2 columns, but really we want header to span the whole top probably, right? We want to give header all of the space that's happening there. So let's do that. Let's go back to our first media query here for 500 pixels. Oops. And let's say, okay, cool. Yeah, we generally want 2 columns. However, we want header to really span the whole top. So now I'm going to go ahead and call out header. And I'm going to tell it to grid column start in column 1 and grid column end in column 3, right? 3 minus 1 is 2, and I've got 2 columns, so that adds up. I'll go ahead and hit save. I'll go back into my browser, and there it is. Header now spans those 2 columns. It starts in row 1, column 1. Here's column 2, and then here's column 3. This is where it ends. 3 minus 1 is 2. So we have header spanning those 2 things until it reaches 600 pixels, and then it still does that, right? It still spans 2. And there's other ways we can write that. So I'm going to go back to here, So I could write grid column start 1, grid column end 3, or I can write shorthand, which is grid column start in 1 / end in 3, and save and refresh in my browser, and that's the exact same thing. There it is at the bigger size where I have 3 columns. It's still spanning 2. There's yet another way to do it. We can say grid column and literally say span, and then the number of columns we want it to span, and hit save. Refresh in my browser is doing the exact same thing. There's a lot of ways to do the exact same thing, and whichever way the syntax makes sense to you is how you should do it. All right, but we did notice that once we go into 600, we no longer have header going to all 3 columns. That's because we've explicitly said just span 2. And there's a way to get around that too. If we want header to always be the top row, what we can do is go into grid-column and tell it to start in 1 and end in -1, which means it doesn't matter how many FRs there are. It doesn't matter how many fractions. Always start in the first and end in the last. So I'll hit save and I'll refresh, and you'll see nav jump down here because it was like, oh, there's not any room in this row. So global style, 1 column. Our first media query has it split into 2 columns, except for that we've specified explicitly that header should start at the beginning and end at the end, wherever that is, whether it's 2 columns or 3 columns. Cool. So that's an explicit way that we can do it. Now we can go in and we can tell anything to be wherever we want it. So if we go back to the normal document flow, it's in order: header, nav, main, aside, footer, and a screen reader is going to read it in order, and a search engine is going to read it in order. But visually, we can put things wherever we want them to go. And now we're going to kind of double down on that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and mess with my last media query, the one that's a minimum of 600. And I'm going to start putting stuff kind of wherever I want it to. So I have 3 columns. I have header spanning the whole top of the page, right? But now I can start putting them in whatever rows that I want. I've only specified what the columns should be. The columns should have a template of 3 with header spanning the whole page. But now I can go specifically in and make them in whatever row and column I want them to. So I'm going to go back to header, and I'm going to say, great, keep doing grid column 1 - -1, but your grid row is now going to be grid row, what do we have, 3. So I want you to be in grid row 3. I'm going to save and refresh. And now header still starts at the first column, ends at the last column, but now it's in row 3. And all of the rest of the content just shuffled to its normal document flow. So back to nav, main, aside, and footer. All right, footer only gets 1 space, and this is the space that is implicit. But now we can put footer, let's put footer at the top. Why not? So we get to write another rule. We're going to call out footer, and we're going to tell footer, you should be in grid-row 1. We want you to be at the top. Save, refresh in the browser, and now footer is first. Footer is first. It gets 1 column of space, but it starts on row 1. It's explicitly been told to be in row 1, and it's been told to be 1 column of length. So there it is. Now, can I change these guys? Sure. Let's take main and put main here in the second column. So I'm going to go back into my code. I'm going to talk to main, and I'm going to say, I want you to be in grid-column, start in 2, end in 3. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to go back and refresh, and look at what it did. it's in 2, starts column 2, ends in column 3, but implicitly the browser decided that was probably on row 2. It didn't know, right? Because nav is implicitly now first because we've in things that we haven't specified, because we specified footer in row 1, we specified header in row 3, and now implicitly it's just kind of deciding where else it's going to go. So now it's in row 2, it's starting in column 2, and it's ending in column 3. But we wanted it to be right here. We wanted it to be in row 1. So now we're going to tell it to be. So we'll go back and we'll hear grid-row, and we'll say, no, be in 1. And we'll hit save, and we'll refresh, and there it goes. It's like, cool. You've explicitly said you want me to be in row 1, starting column 2, ending column 3, so that's where it goes. Nav and aside, we didn't specify yet, so they're going implicitly wherever the web page thinks the order is going. Let's switch nav to be 2 columns and start on row 2. Gonna go in, gonna add another rule. I'm going to tell nav to start in grid-row 2 and or 1 and end in 2. Is that what I said? Yeah, we're going to put it right here. Row 2, column 1 and 2. So we're going to start grid row 2 and end in 3, and then we're going to put it in grid-column. We want it to start in 1 and we want it to end in 2. When we wanted it to end in 3, right? Because we wanted it to span 2 columns. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and I'm going to refresh, and there it is. Nav is starting in grid row 2, and it's in columns 1 and 2. So you can literally put things wherever you want to by explicitly telling them what row and what column to be in. And you can keep shuffling that around until you get the effect you want. And here's why it's important that we separate the HTML and the CSS. If you had this on your screen, you were told this is the order they should be in, you might code this with footer first, then main, aside, nav, and header. But that doesn't make any sense. That narrative doesn't make any sense because it starts with the end. We don't want to start with the end. We want the HTML to be in the order that it would be read, as if we're telling a story. So the beginning, the middle, and the end. But with this style, we can make it look like whatever we want. We can completely change. And there's absolutely good reasons that we would want to do that visually. And we can do that. All right. Hey, as always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.